Good morning, everybody. This is Aaron Betts with IntelesysOne. We're going to get started. I'm sure a couple people will jump in as we're going, but we want to respect everybody's time that's here. We want to thank you for taking the time to join us for a demonstration of the Brightmetrics product. It is the really a go-to reporting package for the Mitel, ShoreTel phone systems. And we have with us Peter from Brightmetrics, who is their VP of product. And just real quick, because we are going to have quite a few people on this webinar today, we're going to have everybody muted. We will have an opportunity for questions at the end. So if you can save those, or if you want to enter those questions into the chat box, you can do that as well. Again, my name is Aaron Betts with IntelesysOne. I am the COO here. Most of you probably know me from the day-to-day operations side of things, so welcome. I will be covering some of the kind of top benefits that we've seen our clients use Brightmetrics for, and the benefits that they've got, those that are using it have gotten from it. And Peter is going to cover some of the top metrics that really could benefit the company if you are watching them and keeping track of them. Okay, with that, I'm going to give Austin just a minute to introduce himself as well with Intelisys, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, as Aaron said, my name is Austin Parr. I'm Client Relationship Manager over here at IntelesysOne. My job is to make sure you guys are aware of any new products that we've partnered with and give you the opportunity to decide if the ROI from this type of tool makes sense for you. And really, when it boils down to it, just to make sure you guys are happy. Thank you all for attending today.
Good morning, this is Jesus, Contract IT at Sierra Leone.
Thank you for joining.
We're actually.
Sorry, we're actually.
Is that my cue?
Was it? We're actually going to be muting everybody until the end. We're going to have a question section, so just so you're aware.
Awesome. Well, I think that's my cue. So hi everyone, I'm Peter Hornberger with Brightmetrics. A big thanks to the IntelesysOne team for having me on today. I always appreciate the opportunity to show off Brightmetrics and talk about what it is we do. I'm going to take you through a presentation today that goes into the 5 metrics that we see most commonly used to master customer experience. I'll share my screen here and this will pop up for everyone. We're going to do a mix of things. For those that don't know anything about Brightmetrics yet, at a very top level, we are a reporting and analytics platform that overlays on top of what used to be called the ShoreTel system. Many of you probably still know it by that name, and is obviously now the Mitel MyVoice Connect system. That data and analytics plays out in a number of different ways. We can present dashboards and reports. We can do things like staffing forecasts and real-time visualizations. You're going to get a flavor of all that today. I'll walk you through it. But rather than just take you through a generic walkthrough of the product, what I like to do with these sorts of webinars is actually walk through, what does all this mean? Data analytics, everyone has a picture in their mind of what data analytics is, and we have a great platform for data analytics. But what's really important about that is not the actual tool itself and the ways that you measure information, though you'll see that, our goal is to make that as easy as possible. But the real benefit is the ROI that comes from it. What happens when you start paying attention to various data points? Even going farther back than that, what are the data points that you should be paying attention to? And so that's really what I want to kind of frame this around today. I want to show you the Brightmetrics application, but I want to do it with a lens towards what are some measurements that perhaps you've thought about, but you're not sure how to benchmark around, or perhaps some measurements that you've never looked at before across your system. So that's what we're going to run through today. Again, there will be a section for questions at the end. Please feel free to type those in and ask those. And for the team that is watching those questions come in, if there's something that makes sense to address in line as people type those in, I'm more than happy to do that as well. So I don't mind answering things as we run through this. I'll give you a glance at the 5 metrics we're going to walk through today, but personally, I'm not a big fan of introductions or long agenda slides about a presentation that I'm going to walk you through in just a few minutes. So this is a look at where we're going. These are the metrics. You can kind of scan through them, but really I'm going to dive right into the first one. The one thing that I will say as we kind of get into these is we talk about at a very top level, the title of my presentation today is 5 metrics to master customer experience. Realistically, when you look at that, the levers that you have to pull around customer experience come from a few different key areas, and these metrics are going to tie together into them. They're really kind of the 4 pillars is what we call them here at Brightmetrics. Those things are, A, your customer experience, but closely tied and linked to that are a number of things that tie into your operational efficiency. That could be your staffing level, that could be your team's productivity, that could be your training programs, your automation. Those are all different things that tie into this. And as we move through these metrics, you'll see how those things ebb and flow and correlate together to give you a meaningful understanding of what's my customer's experience. When someone picks up the phone to dial into your organization, what is that experience and what could you do to improve that? Where is that strong? Where are there potentially gaps? That's what data analytics is all about. If you look through that list of 5 metrics I provided, you may recognize some of those, you may not know what they are, but if there's one that most organizations that we engage with know what it is, it's the measurement of abandon rate. Abandon rate is a measurement that's commonly used in group environments. And when I say group environments, there's a lot of different ways to have a call come into your system and route out from there, but almost every system is using in some fashion a dynamic routing, whether that's a hunt group, a work group, a bridged call appearance, maybe an advanced contact center application. All of those are ways that essentially a call comes in and is fielded to a team of people, a group of resources. Abandon rate is simply when a call comes into that point in the system, what percentage of those callers are hanging up the phone? If it's a work group, what percent are hanging up while they're in queue? If it's a hunt group, what percent hang up while they ring? Same thing with a BCA. So the terminology might shift a little bit as to what that's measuring, but in general, it's when a customer is waiting, what percentage of those customers are hanging up the phone during that waiting period of time? That's a measurement that's really, really valuable. And again, if I had to guess it, which one of these measurements that we're going to walk through today you looked at before, this might be the one. What I commonly find, though, is organizations that we engage with look at this metric and assume that any abandon rate at all, anything greater than 0%, is a really, really bad thing. And we actually don't think that's the case. In fact, the data typically tells a very, very different story. And so when I talk about abandon rate today, what I want to show you and explain to you is why targeting a 0% abandon rate is probably very, very inefficient for your organization. It actually doesn't do a lot to boost your overall customer experience satisfaction. You'll see a graph that's on the screen here. This is something that I've borrowed from a company called MetricNet. MetricNet is a really interesting organization that draws out a lot of key stats and trends around grouped environments. They've worked with over 3,000 customers at this point to correlate a number of pieces of data. One of the things that they've done is paid attention to abandon rate and how it correlates to customer satisfaction. So when you look at the chart that I have on screen here, along the x-axis, you're going to see call abandonment rate. Starts at 0%, goes up to 30% on the x-axis there. On the left-hand side, you're going to see customer satisfaction starting at 40% and going up to 100%. Here's what I want you to notice is, well, I didn't mean to go forward yet. There we go. Here's what I want you to notice. At 0%, 0 calls abandoning, everyone is getting connected to a person is what that's essentially saying. The customer satisfaction is at 92, 93% if you look at that trend line. So, first thing to notice, look, being able to answer every call doesn't mean that every customer is satisfied with what happens once that call is answered. So there are other factors at play, and in fact, we'll get into some of those things a little bit later. But here's what's really important about this. Notice that 92%, your customer satisfaction metrics typically stay in that range for a little while on this curve. In fact, if we look as this kind of shifts across the way, it's not until about 4% abandon rate that you start to see a dip or a drop in the customer satisfaction measurement here. So what that tells me is customer satisfaction is essentially the same at 4% or at 0%. My question to you, and the kind of the way that I would pose this is, if that's true, then why would you want a 0% abandon rate over a 4% abandon rate? If you're targeting that 0%, you're not necessarily creating a lift or a benefit around your overall customer satisfaction. Here's why. It's very easy to understand why this is the case. Think about your own engagements and interactions with grouped environments before, where you're calling into, customer support or a technical support line, something like that. A lot of times you may pick up your phone to make that dial and then realize, oh, you know what, I have another call that's very, very important that I need to make right now, or maybe another call came in, and you'll hang up, and you waited maybe 2 seconds, hung up the phone and said, I'll do this later. In that case, you're not an unsatisfied customer because you didn't get connected to someone. You opted to decline that call, and you did it rather quickly. If you're expecting your team to answer those kinds of calls, what you're doing is probably significantly overstaffing yourself. You're setting up your organization in such a way that you always have someone available to answer a call within 2, 5, 10 seconds. And if you're able to accomplish that, what that typically indicates is an overstaffing issue. So in general, that 4% is a really, really great lower limit here. On the other side, notice this trend line. Once you get into that 4% range, now you start to see the customer satisfaction dip. Now, everyone's threshold for how much their customer satisfaction can dip is different, but in general, we typically see most people are happy operating within that, 87 to 93% range. When you look at this correlation, the percentage of abandoned callers at about 8% is when you're past that 87%. So customer satisfaction when you're over an 8% abandon rate is going to start to decline significantly. So from an industry standard in a group environment, a hunt group, a work group, a bridge call appearance, you want to target somewhere in this range. You want to set your goal to be, hey, we want to handle calls within 4 to 8 seconds. And if you're not in that range, if you're over 8%, you're probably creating a negative customer interaction. If you're under 4%, you're probably inefficient in the sense of staffing. You probably have more people than you need to serve the calls that are coming in. In that case, you might redistribute resources. You might put people on other projects. There's all kinds of things you could do in that scenario and circumstance. But that's kind of where this measurement plays out. Now, what does that look like in Brightmetrics? Well, let me flip over to Brightmetrics. This is a glance at Brightmetrics. I will tell you, I don't know if there's any active Brightmetrics customers on the call today specifically, but this might look a little bit different from the Brightmetrics you've seen before. We've actually just gone through a UI refresh in the last couple of weeks where we've launched a new UI called Radiance. This is a look at it. It's something that's rolling out to all of our customers right now. For any of you that are not using Brightmetrics yet, this will be the environment you'll jump into. For those that have the classic environment, you'll be able to use both in tandem for a little while as well. But this is a glance at a dashboard. And what I can see here is on this dashboard, I'm monitoring in particular a work group. And you can see there's actually all kinds of dashboard tabs I have created here. I can scroll through this list. And this particular customer, they do a little bit of everything in their system. They have all of those things I mapped out at the beginning: work groups, hunt groups, contact center, bridge call appearances, all of it. So this will be a great customer when we get to that question section at the end. If anyone has particular data perspectives they're looking for, I can probably find an example within their data. But notice here that over the last 30 days, this group has a 2.5% abandon rate. That's what this particular chart in the upper left-hand corner is telling me, along with some other stats around total call volume, number of calls handled, things like that. That 2.5%, just finger in the wind out the gate, what that tells me is this group is potentially a little bit overstaffed. If I look right below, though, I can see some further validation of that. In general, this is showing me that percentage rate as it trends over time. So I can see how that's shifting over time. There are a lot of days where they are well below that 4 to 8% range that I've mapped here. There are some days when they drift above, but worst case scenario, they're still in the 8%. It's 8.5% here. But in general, they're trending very, very low. So that's kind of the first indicator that we look for around these 5 metrics. Here's what I hate to do for you though, is give you a measurement like that and not give you any kind of solution. So give you a measurement, you go and run that data yourself and find out, oh, well, I have a 15 or a 20% abandon rate, or I have a 1% abandon rate. What do I do? What's that indicative of? That's where our second measurement really comes into play. And our second measurement today is wait times. Now, wait times, this is one of those data terms that is going to shift depending on what kind of environment you have set up. So if you're running bridge call appearances or hunt groups, when I say wait time, what I mean is ring time. If someone dials into a hunt group, they're going to ring for a period of time, whether that's ringing simultaneously or round robin or top down. They're going to ring for a period of time. That's the wait time there, the amount of time they're waiting to get connected. When you get into a work group, that's actually called queue time in the data structure, and the contact center actually has both queue time and wait time. It gets really confusing as you shift between those. In general, what I mean when I try to define wait time is from the moment that a caller enters one of your routing groups, how long are they waiting until they exit? And I want you to measure that in two different ways. You want to look at first the overall wait time. That is the average amount of time that customers wait before any action is taken. And then I want you to compare that to the abandoned wait times. That's for just the abandoned callers. How long do they wait on average before they hang up the phone? I'm going to continue talking about this, but I'm going to do it in the context of that group that we were playing with. So what I see here is I've got some of these stats. I actually have this as a work group. So queue time is what that wait time is called from a data standpoint. I've got a chart here that shows the average queue time as that trends over time as well. But what I actually want to do is start to layer some of this data together. So I'm going to click on the magnifying glass in the upper right-hand corner of the chart. And a little bit about Brightmetrics here. Anytime you're looking at a data point, we really prioritize giving you the ability to drill into that information and play with it further. A trend line like this, whether you're looking at something that's focused on customer satisfaction like this, or you're trying to run some sort of a configuration metric, or maybe you're looking at trunk utilization or something like that, it's really important in a trend line to be able to see, okay, I have identified a trend or I see an anomaly, but oftentimes the graph is going to be good at identifying the trend. You're going to need more data and more information to really understand that trend or anomaly. That's where these drill throughs become crucial. If I click on the magnifying glass in the upper right hand corner, this opens a new tab in my browser. Shows me the exact same chart along the top, that average queue time. I can play around with this a little bit. This is valuable just to understand. We have all kinds of different visualizations, pie charts, bar charts, text charts. You can play around with each chart and configure it the way you want and save those things onto the dashboard so it's set in whatever perspective that you care about. Data visualization is extremely personal, and what I think might be a good chart might not be something that is a logical way for you to understand your data. Doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong or vice versa. What it just means is that I think through the structure of my data a little bit differently, and we really want to give you the tools to set it up to process this information in the best way possible for each individual. So you've got the ability to play with visualizations. I'm going to collapse that chart away though and actually focus on the report that pops up down below. So in this drill down perspective, we're carrying our chart over, but we're also pulling up a reporting view. For any of you that are familiar with pivot tables in Excel, you're going to feel right at home with Brightmetrics reporting structure. Essentially, this report by default is showing me that this group has an average queue time of 11 seconds. So that wait time means that for all of the callers into this group, they waited on average 11 seconds. Pretty short. If we picked up the phone right now, we could expect we're going to wait about 11 seconds on average. But remember, we're coming into this view to get a little bit more detail and data. So you'll notice that I have on the left-hand side these fields and layouts. I can actually collapse these or expand them if I need to. We want them out initially. This is where I can add more information and detail onto the report specifically. So in fields, I have what's called dimensions and values. Values are measurements, and dimensions are the ways that you slice, dice, and filter those measurements. It's really easy to use. It's a drag and drop system. I can look at this report and say, you know what, I want to break up the call volume. First, I want to understand how many calls we're talking about over this 30-day period. So I'm going to come to values. I'm going to grab count of all calls, drop this right onto the values. The report reruns, and now we know that we're playing with 750 calls. I can then say, okay, I want to take the work group name off here, and I want to layer on instead the hour a day. I want to understand how this is shifting over time throughout my days on average. And then lastly, I want to pull in the exit reason into the columns here. Now, exit reason is a term that some of you may or may not have heard before. It's a very data sounding term. It's something that's pulled. Essentially, it's looking at in a group. That could be a hunt group, a work group, for each call appearance. The idea of exit reason is when a call left that particular routing environment, why did it leave? That could be the call abandoned. There's an exit reason of abandon that shows up here. That could be that it got forwarded to another destination. That could be that it got connected to an agent, in this case, a work group agent. There's other ones that'll pop up depending on your own configuration. In this case, this group uses these particular three. So you can see my report instantly is showing me a lot more data and detail than I had before. I've now got hours of the day listed out on the left-hand side. I've got two measurements that are on here, and I've got the exit reasons broken out. Let's scroll to the bottom. So here's what I've done is I've said, okay, in total there were 751 calls. Those calls waited on average 11 seconds. Here's what's interesting. The abandoned callers, there were 17 of them. They waited on average 29 seconds. What that tells me, your abandoned callers, they are the ones that are indicators of how long your callers are willing to wait. Your overall wait time is an indicator of how long you're asking your customers to wait. When there is an imbalance between how long you ask a customer to wait and how long they're willing to wait, that's when you start to see yourself drift outside of that 4 to 8% abandon rate range. If you have a high abandon rate, it's almost always because your callers aren't willing to wait as long as you're asking them to wait. If you have a low abandon rate, it's indicative that your callers are actually probably willing to wait a little bit longer than you're making them. That's what's happening here. They have on average a 2% abandon rate. Well, we can see that their callers are willing to wait upwards of 30 seconds. If you had a 15 or a 20% abandon rate, and we see this all the time, in that case, typically, your overall wait time, you might be asking customers to wait a minute and a half, but they're in reality willing to wait about 45 seconds and they start hanging up. So those two metrics together can give you some information about, oh, well, why is this happening? How do we adjust for it? There's all kinds of adjustments you can make, by the way. Staffing's the obvious one. If you have a high abandon rate, you can solve that problem if it's a wait time problem by simply having more people available. More people available to answer the phone means your wait times are lower, means your abandon rate drives downwards. But look, I understand, and you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I don't always have the time or the resources to hire a new person right now. That's totally understandable. Look, it's hard to find the right people. It's hard to train them. It's expensive. You might not have the budget for it, all those things. If that's the case, you can play around with some different configurations. You could do things like play around with the music or the message that plays to a caller while they're waiting. If you can impact their ability to wait a little bit longer, that's really, really valuable in that case. So that's kind of what our second measurement is about. I'll move on from this one. There's a lot more that I could fill a lot of time talking about this, but we've got 3 more to get through, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for that. So I'll move on to the next one from here. But again, abandon rate, wait time, great staffing level indicators, great customer satisfaction experience indicators. I want to shift that lens a little bit now, where we've been talking about, well, what happens while a caller's waiting to get connected? And many of you can probably think to your own experiences as customers waiting to get connected. You have an opinion formulating the longer that you wait, and your satisfaction is being driven by that. But in a lot of ways, as soon as you get connected to someone, no matter how long you waited, all sins are somewhat forgiven there. And now your experience and your satisfaction shifts to, can the person I've been connected with help me? And that's where this next measurement starts to look at. It looks at the next leg of the call. We're done waiting. Now we've connected. What are those engagements and interactions like? There's 2 measurements that I want you to counterbalance against one another. The average handle time and the percentage of calls transferred. I'm going to explain these 2 things to you. Again, these are ones where, depending on your own particular environment, the actual data terms will change. Average handle time is a word that's drawn out of work group environments. What it's measuring is the total talk time, hold time, and wrap time that an agent spends on average with each one of their callers. Now, wrap time is a very specific measurement just for work groups. So if you're looking at a hunt group or a BCA or just a general employee, what you care about there is forget about the wrap time. That doesn't exist in that configuration. What you care about there is just talk and hold time. So when we say average handle time, it's basically a measurement of what's the average amount of time that a call ties up an individual, a person within your organization. Again, handle time is what it's called in work groups. If you're looking at hunt groups or just general users or bridge calls, in that case, you're just looking for, in those scenarios, your talk and your hold time. The other side of this is percentage of calls transferred. This one's a little bit easier to understand. When a call gets connected to someone, what percentage of those calls do they resolve themselves versus transfer on somewhere else? That's an easy one to understand why that can be a frustrating experience. Someone is transferring a lot of calls. It's either an indication they don't know how to answer the questions they're being asked, if it's something like a support group, or it's an indication that, you know, maybe they're taking certain calls and saying, oh, I don't want to deal with that. Let me just pass that off somewhere else. So bunch of, you know, different kind of outputs of that. Here's how you use that measurement. I'm going to go back to our report here. I'm actually going to, on the fly, completely change the report that we've been looking at. I'm going to pull off that hour of day grouping and trade it for party name. Now, in the context of this work group, the party name is the actual people that calls connected with. Now, you'll see that not all of these are people. There's a listing for none. Those are the calls that didn't connect to anyone. There's a listing for 1754. That's a voicemail box that calls get forwarded to after hours in this group. So bear that in mind. But then you look at Christian and Barbara and Teresa. Those are individual users that field calls out of this particular group. I'm also going to get rid of our exit reason here, and I'm going to pull off the queued average time. That's not a measurement that's really helpful when we're looking at agent or user stats. I am going to layer on those two measurements I just told you about, though. I've got the percentage of calls that were transferred, and I've also got down at the bottom here a time measurement for the average handle time. Now, again, bear in mind, average handle time is what I'm pulling because this is a work group, but notice that there's also average hold time, average talk time. Those are the things you'd want to pay attention to in a non-work group environment. What I'm doing here is pulling these measurements, and then I can look and see, okay, across the 751 calls, well, what percentage of those calls were transferred by the agent that connected with the call? In this case, it's fairly high, 41.11%. Now, here's the thing. You're going to ask me, or you may be thinking about asking me, well, what's a good transfer rate? What's a good measurement for that? The truth is that's a really, really hard thing for me to give you a benchmark around.
Well, very good.
Sorry, I'm getting, I don't know if I'm hearing somebody's audio come through. I'll keep going, but if you're on the line, I don't know who's controlling the mute, unmute, but it sounds like somebody might be unmuted. I'm imagining I'm not the only one hearing that. Anyway, I'll keep pressing on. So, the average transfer rate for an individual user, that's a really hard thing to get a benchmark for. People ask us for that all the time. Here's why it's really hard. If you run in your organization, say an operator group somewhere, your operators, their job is to be somewhat of a white glove experience for your customers. Your caller comes in, they get connected to someone very, very quickly. That person's an operator who says, you know, why are you calling? And the customer explains, and then that person transfers them off to that destination. It's to make it a more efficient routing. In that particular scenario, that person might transfer 90% of their calls, and that's perfectly fine. But if you flip that around and find a technical support group that has an individual user that's transferring 90% of their calls, that's almost always going to be a very, very bad thing for that group. And so it's really hard to kind of give a benchmark of you should set your target transfer rate at this particular number. What you want to do with a measurement like this is use it comparatively. If the group averages 41.11%, at the top end, there's an agent here that's transferring 50% of the time, and at the bottom end, someone who's transferring 21%. That's a huge spread, almost a 30% difference between those two people. Someone who transfers more is typically an indication of someone who's perhaps undertrained or, again, being lazy with their calls. Someone who transfers too little, well, not too little, someone who transfers a lower number, that's what you're typically looking for. you want to benchmark against those averages and try to draw a team of people together towards a similar number here. But again, 41%, that's not necessarily a bad number in and of itself. What's bad is the outliers. How do we get people to exhibit similar behavior so there's a consistent caller experience no matter who they connect with? Same thing with average handle time. You want to find that your team is spending roughly about the same amount of time on the phone as one another. You don't want people spending too long. That's operationally inefficient for you. You don't want people spending too little time. That's going to be something where the caller themselves might feel like they didn't get enough time to get their question answered or get taken care of in that way. So in general, this is also a great measurement for sales environments. In sales environments, someone who spends too little time on the phone relative to their rest of their team, that's usually someone who's not quite as clear on objection handles or not as good as at keeping someone on the phone. So generally in a sales team, you want to see higher handle times, not lower handle times. That's our third measurement there. Our fourth measurement, this is another one that's fairly easy to understand, agent available percentage and percentage of calls answered. If someone's phone rings in your organization, you want them answering that call. And if they're not answering that call, especially if it's a dynamic routing environment where they have the ability to make themselves available or unavailable, if you're running work groups with agents logging in and out, if someone's not available, they should be logged out. And if they're not answering calls, it either means that they are literally ignoring their phone or they're not using the tools that you've given them to log in and out appropriately. Same thing with, you have call handling mode set up on your system. If someone's not picking up their phone consistently, that can be an indication they're not using those routing rules appropriately. Agent available percentage, this is something where if you are running a work group and you're using log in and log out time, you want to be able to measure, well, what percentage of the time is my team on the phone versus not? You could also do this across the general user extension, look at what percentage of their time is spent talking on the phone. But the idea here is to figure out, well, in a work group environment, if our team's job is to be on the phone day in and day out, then we want to expect that they're spending, roughly 70 to 80% of their day engaged on the phone. If they're not, that means they're spending a lot of wasted time just waiting for calls to come in. Again, that ties back into those measurements around staffing level. If you have agents that are spending 50 or 60% of their day not on the phone, that's typically an indication of an overstaffed environment. I can show you a quick little dashboard that kind of breaks this out. I've got a dashboard on here that's actually labeled my 5 metrics dashboard. I'll flip over to this one, and you'll see there's a bar chart on the right-hand side here that'll load in just a moment. It's going to show me the available percentage next to the percentage of calls answered. In general, if someone's using the system appropriately, they should be answering their phone 95 to 100% of the time. And in a strong environment, we want to see that the answer percentage is that the available percentage is relatively low. We don't want people just idle all day long. We want them engaged on the phone. This group's, somewhere around about a 40% idle time. It's maybe just a smidge high. I tend to like to see that around 30% or lower. The last measurement I want to show off for you today is wrap codes. This is something I always like to throw in one thing for anyone who is on contact center or considering contact center. If you're on contact center, you have the added benefit of wrap codes. Your agent can flag their calls, mapping them to particular key dispositions. We here at Brightmetrics love wrap codes because it allows you to see what are customers calling about most frequently and how long do those different kinds of interactions take for our team to resolve. That can give you some really good indications into where you might need to train your team, where you might need to use automation to drive down call volume. For instance, we have in this group in particular that's on that dashboard we created, their most common wrap code is account info. It's 2019 and a lot of organizations provide account info through websites. If customers are constantly calling to get account info that they could be getting from a website, perhaps it's just that hasn't been communicated to the customer base. And if instead we put some kind of a message in front of the group here to say, hey, did you know you can get this information at xyz.com and not even have to wait to connect to an individual user? that might decrease the call volume, and especially for understaffed groups or groups that have high abandon rates, that can be a really valuable way to decrease the load on the team. So wrap codes can be really helpful for identifying those things, along with identifying what's taking our team a long time. You know, and this is a utility billings group from a municipality. They have these leak usage calls that take a really long time. I'd want to dig into that and go interview their team and figure out, why did these particular calls take so much longer than everything else? You might draw out some interesting information. You might find that, oh, well, our team just needs some training around how to handle those, or maybe there's some kind of information that we need to collect from customers before we connect them to a team member. All of that kind of information can be really, really helpful. So that's the 5 metrics. There are 2 other things I want to make sure I show you in Brightmetrics, and then I'm going to pass it over to run through to let Aaron run through some other things for you. But I wanted to show you one more step in the drill through. You'll notice here that I'm looking at a list of agents. I'm actually going to change our time range down to something like 5 days and just find a small number of calls. There are times when this particular view here is not going to be enough information for you. You really want to dig into a little bit more detail. Let's take Christian, for example. Christian transferred 38% of their calls. If I want to know where those calls got transferred to, I have another drill down perspective. I can click on the user's name. What this does is actually run a detailed query against the Mitel or ShoreTel server to pull up the 47 call records that Christian engaged in. That gives me another report that's listing out all the details, the timestamp, the party name, the caller ID, transfer destination, where did the call get transferred to, along with various measurements here. In Brightmetrics, you can click on any one of these call records to pull up what's called a cradle-to-grave report. And a cradle-to-grave report summarizes for that individual call from start to finish what happened on that particular call. So in this particular call, this call came in and initially hit a voicemail. From there, the caller keyed out of the voicemail, got navigated to this bridged call appearance, this UT water quality. From there, nobody was available, so it dumped into a voicemail, and then the caller said, I really don't want to leave a voicemail, so keyed out again and went to the UT main work group here. From that work group, waited 12 seconds, got connected to Christian. Christian then transferred that call basically back through the same workflow, probably said something like, hey, yeah, the person you want to connect with isn't available. Let me get you back over to that voicemail. Connected the caller to the voicemail ultimately, and then the caller left the voicemail there, we presume, over that 1 minute. This view is immensely valuable, whether it's just spot checking some of the various interactions or maybe evaluating a particular call record and trying to figure out what happened on that call. Why did we have a frustrating experience for one of our customers? You know, maybe someone's telling you, oh, I waited for 15 minutes. Well, was it actually 15 minutes? Those are the kinds of things you can draw out of this. And for those of you specifically that are using work groups, we also have a tie-in to a report called Team Activity. That allows you on a work group to see, while a call was waiting in your work group, what other agents were logged in and what were they doing during that period of time. This call only waited 12 seconds, but during that 12 seconds, Christian and Barbara were both logged in, and I can see for each one of those agents of this work group, I can see what was happening. For Christian, Christian was being presented this call. For Barbara, Barbara was in an idle state, so they ring through in a longest idle fashion. Barbara was probably going to be presented with this call next. You can imagine if a call waited for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, this is a really useful view to figure out, was someone just ignoring their phone? Were they being presented calls the entire time? Was someone not logged in that was supposed to be? This is a great way to audit those individual experiences and figure out what happened. And the last thing I want to show you today is something called call flow reports. This is something that is actually a unique benefit that you receive in Brightmetrics if you wind up signing up for Brightmetrics, something that you'll receive because you're an IntelesysOne customer. IntelesysOne is one of our premier partners, and there's some specific features that we make available to the IntelesysOne team and their customers. This is a report that's a little bit different. Everything we've been talking about so far today is tying into call metrics. This is a report that actually ties into configuration data. And in Brightmetrics, we have the ability to tie into a lot of config data, things like show me a list of all the IP phones that are configured and show me that data by site. Show me a breakdown of all the DID and DNS numbers. By far and large, the best of all these features is this call routing diagram. This allows me to take any starting point in an environment. You can see the list here, auto attendance, work groups, hunt groups, route points, dial numbers. We also have some tie-ins to ECC environment routing points as well, so IRN service scripts. I'm going to use for this particular customer an auto attendant that's fairly active for them. It's called the UT Main Auto Attendant extension 4200. I'm going to run this diagram. What this does is it queries the system to say, okay, when a caller enters that particular auto attendant, what are all the branching paths they can take? This actually, even though it's not looking at call metrics, it actually ties directly into our conversation around customer and caller satisfaction. When someone enters your system, especially if your system's been in place for a little while, there are always potential changes that you might have made to your call flow over time that have resulted farther down in the chain in a call being orphaned somewhere. It gets stuck where it can't take further action, or perhaps it winds up, looping through the system during certain workflows. Those things are really, really hard to identify unless someone tells you about it or you actually physically dial through all of the different phone trees that you have configured. This diagram is a great way to identify those things. What it does is build a diagram like this that shows me all the branching paths a caller could take when they hit the starting point, in this case, an auto attendant. Let me drill in here to this auto attendant and kind of show you what's happening. This auto attendant's configured like some of yours may be as well. There are 6 different options and a timeout across this auto attendant. If someone presses, for instance, 4 or 5, they're routed to a work group. That work group is set to ring these 6 members in a longest idle fashion with 4 rings per member. If someone were to press 1, for example, they're routed to a submenu here. That submenu has some options. I've alluded to a couple times, this particular customer has contact center, so this submenu kind of winds up routing them into contact center, and you can see some of the components from there. And then, for example, here's another work group. I like this work group in their environment because it shows same thing, members, ring patterns, but it also shows overflow destination. So no answer, no agents logged in. If any of you use queue steps, I don't know if there's a hunt group example on here, but this will show you hunt groups as well. I don't think they have one. I always like to show one of those off. But you can kind of imagine if I zoom out, if calls are getting stuck somewhere, like for instance, this particular area here, that's actually a voicemail, so that's a fine place to get stuck. But if calls are getting stuck or if they're looping through the system, this is a great way to identify that. And again, if your system's been in place for a little while, a lot of times, you'll make changes early on in the chain here, and it's really, really hard to identify through the menus in Director to figure out, oh, well, that's going to have an awful, impact on callers much later in the chain. This is something you can run this on demand. It queries your system directly every time. So if you make a change, you can come here and check your work and see, did that do anything that I wasn't expecting? You can also export this along with actually anything in Brightmetrics, any of the reports or cradle to graves or dashboards I've shown you. All those things can be exported. And then the last thing I'll point out is this can actually be run for different dates or points in time. So a lot of times call flow changes are being made in environments around holiday schedules or after hour schedules. This is a great way to be able to see what's the system configured to do at those points in time. As you can probably tell, I could keep talking for hours about this sort of stuff. I will stop there because I know there's a few other things we want to run through today. I will say, obviously, I'm more than happy to stick around if there are any questions that people want to have, but we're always happy to have conversations about this, take you through deeper dives on your own information, even offer up, free trials and things like that. So, for the sake of today, that's the 5 metrics. That's some of the key details around Brightmetrics and how we interact. I'll pass it over. I think, Aaron, you're taking it away next, so I'll pass it over.
I am. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it. Peter is one of the foremost experts in Brightmetrics that I've encountered, and he knows his stuff. And I really appreciate the insight that he's able to give us. And so kind of what I wanted to do is just take a few minutes and walk through. I know there's some people on this call that are kind of management of the ShoreTel system, Mitel system in your environment, and how do we take some of the day-to-day stuff and make it easier for you with Brightmetrics. Some of it will be a little redundant to what Peter just showed us, but I just kind of wanted to give some real-world examples that we've run into with some of our clients that, like I said, are using Brightmetrics. I have our system up on the board here. First of all, can everybody see my screen okay? Austin, does that look all right?
Yeah, it's coming through for me.
Okay, great. All right. So a couple of the benefits that I want to cover are really kind of, as Peter mentioned, customer satisfaction. We want to make sure that our customers are getting the experience that we would expect them to. One of the interactions that we had with one of our city clients is they started getting a lot of calls that were coming into their operator. Residents were very unhappy with the experience that they were getting, and they weren't quite sure what was happening. They were doing a little bit different ideas on how the operator was going to be answering the calls. And so we went in and ran an on-demand report. Now, this is a sample call that I did into my system. I went ahead and pulled these reports up ahead of time because I'm still getting used to this new Radiant interface that Peter was talking about, and wanted to just have it all ready for you. But this is a call that I made this morning into our system. And as Peter said, you can do so many different reports that are right out of the box. So if I come here, you can see that I've got the typical user activity reports that we see in the standard Mitel reporting, but there's so much further reporting that is offered that makes it so much easier to really dig in and troubleshoot call flow. You can see here that the one I used here was the search by caller ID, but we can look by the dialed number and extension or just the trunk detail, and then the power of the Brightmetrics system, as Peter mentioned, is that we're able to drill into these reports to get deeper into the numbers, deeper into the call flow to see what happened without having to run maybe a different report. With the kind of canned reports that come in the ShoreTel system, you get some of this, but often you have to kind of put together multiple reports to try and get some of the same data that this is offering just right at your fingertips. So here's the call that came in. I'm a customer. I'm upset. I called in, and it took me, 4 minutes to really get to the place that I wanted to be, and that wasn't great. So I'm calling in to complain, and so let's just take a look at that call. As Peter mentioned, there's this cradle to grave option for that call. We can see here that it came in and hit the different route points, and that just helps us to regulate where calls are going, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. Then I hit an auto attendant. I went ahead, I wasn't sure what option to take, so I zeroed out. Zeroed out took me to the operator. It took 8 seconds, the operator picked up. I talked with the operator for a few seconds, and then I was transferred to Maria. I talked with Maria for a minute. Maria wasn't the final destination that I needed. She transferred me to another group to be helped, but nobody was available at that group, and so I ended up going to voicemail. Well, then I called back in, and you can see here, because I queried from my cell phone number, we can see that this was actually 2 separate calls, and so maybe the call that I'm upset about was this one here, not this one here. So it helps to know what interactions that particular phone number has had with our customer service. You can see that I called in, again, got Cheryl, was transferred to the work group, but this time I was picked up, and I talked with Corey for 20 seconds, and then my issue was resolved. A couple of the other things just to mention, if you have the ShoreTel call recording package, there is a tie-in within Brightmetrics into that, so that you can actually get a listing of a call here and listen to that recording if that is something that your company does, which makes it really easy. You can then export it if you need to, but it's, again, all tied into this one interface. Right now we're running another recording package, that you can see here tied in that route point so that that recording got picked up as well. So it shows you all of the different touch points that the system is making because it does tie right into that CDR or call detail record database in the ShoreTel system. So we've looked at this call and we've determined that, you know, let's say I've bounced around just way too much. There's too many touch points for this call. Why is that happening? Well, as Peter showed, the call routing diagram, and so let me just back up 1 second. So the city that was having the issue, we did just this, and we did actually a really big search, and what we saw was the total number of touches or transfers that a call had. And we found one call that had like 14 different transfers. And we pulled that call up and went to that cradle to grave reporting. And we were able to see all the different work groups or hunt groups or operators, people that touched that one particular call before it actually got to the place that it needed to be, much like you saw in my cradle to grave. Well, so then we said, okay, well, let's see why that's happening, and we were able to pull up their call routing diagram and started to walk through the menus, and right away, because it was visual, we saw that there was a call routing loop. And they said, well, wait a minute, that work group isn't supposed to call to that hunt group. It's supposed to go to voicemail if it's not answered, or it's supposed to go to another work group that's backup. Had we had to try and troubleshoot that previously, the engineers here would have gone in, we would have looked at the detailed call history report, or the logs, I should say, which is very difficult to kind of parse and figure out what's happening, to figure out where those are going. Then we would have to go into the actual auto attendant, look up the different options, then go to that work group, look up those options, and it just takes that troubleshooting time from, you know, maybe 30 minutes down to 5. And it was instantly identified and resolved for that city. As far as I've heard, they haven't had any more of those particular issues. So just kind of a real world, how could that report and these diagrams help me troubleshoot something that's happening? Peter mentioned as well the dashboards. And these can be fully customizable, and what's nice about them is you can actually assign people logins to log in and only give them visibility to what they need to see. So if you need to if you need to log in and see, well, here's a system summary. I want to see what my trunks are doing. I want to see what kind of jitter I'm getting or what kind of drops I'm getting. That could be some of your dashboards, but if the call center person or a work group supervisor logs in, maybe they need to see the stats for the work group. And it gives them all of that right on their dashboard. So immediately, even without having to run reports, they're getting all of this data that will help them decide how their work group or system or whatever it is that they're in charge of, how it's running. One of the other things that the Brightmetrics does that I haven't seen in a reporting package before, and this is one of the powerful things for system admins, and Peter mentioned it, is it gives the ability, and let's just go back here to reports, it gives the ability to actually do config reports, call handling modes, DID allocations. If you've got 1,500 DIDs in your system and you're not sure how many I have available, well, you could go into the director and see, well, this particular block has 4 free. I'm not quite sure which ones those are, so let me go in and look at all DIDs that are assigned and try and figure it out. Or I could just run a report through Brightmetrics and see that list of available DIDs. Here's one, for example, that I pulled up this morning, and it's the button layout. So a lot of places, they allow their users to customize the buttons on their phone, but then people aren't sure why things aren't working. They say, my button's not working. Or you need to see if a particular department is all set up the same. You could run a quick report that shows all of the buttons and how they're configured for the people in your system. Another one of the config reports that we can pull, as we mentioned, is this DID DNS destination report. So one of the challenges that we've run into in working with our clients is that many times they'll have a number that's not a DID, it's a DNIS. And for those who don't know what that is, a DNIS is just a pointer for a incoming number to either a group or a person or a menu that already has a DID. So you can only have one DID per menu, but I can point multiple numbers to that menu through a DNIS. The challenge is how many of those numbers are pointed and where do they go? So I just pulled this report up this morning as well that shows DIDs and DNIS numbers and where are they pointed to. What kind of destination is it? Well, it's a user extension, it's a bridge call appearance, it's an off-system extension. For those who tie different systems together or have mobility, this will show you, well, the reason we had that one number in the system and it's pointed for mobility, it's an off-system extension, and that's what allows your mobility to make calls. So again, it's just wanted to give just some quick real-world reports that we've seen our customers use and take advantage of and aid them in their day-to-day operations of the system, help them to, you know, make some of the things that they do a little bit easier. Oh, somebody put us on hold.
Muted.
If I can mute everyone. There we go. Sorry about that. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, you know, often people struggle with the size of their database, and so they may not have a very large call detail retention in their system. One thing that Brightmetrics does do is it maintains up to a 3-year archive of the data that you can run historical reports against, which allows you to keep the size of your database smaller by maybe not having the retention necessarily on the server. It can be through the Brightmetrics system. So that kind of covers most of the issues, or not issues, but items that I wanted to cover, things that, you know, we've seen customers take advantage of. Let me see here. I'm gonna turn this back over to Austin. Are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm right here. Sorry about that.
Not a problem.
Hope everybody
Not a problem.
is hanging in there. I know we're starving for lunch as well, and promise to be brief. So let me see. There I am. Okay. Okay, so at the end of this webinar, you can reach out to us, or you could even send us a chat message if you'd like. I've opened that up. And we'll get you started with a completely free pilot of Brightmetrics where we actually install the software on your system. And you can view all of your own call data or your own reports. So since over here at IntelesysOne, we already have an understanding of your system, and we really know how you're using it for your business's specific needs. Both Brightmetrics and our team will actually sit down with you, and using your own call data, we'll show you exactly how to find the call stats that apply to you. We'll help you discover which stats make sense to track in the customized dashboard. We'll give you some ideas on how this tool could really help your company, and really answer any questions that you might have about the capabilities or applications of Brightmetrics. So just let us know if a completely tailored, free 21-day pilot is something that you're interested in for your company. And thank you guys so much for joining us today. That's going to bring us to the questions section of the webinar. And just as a reminder, we will be sending a summary of Peter's segment on the top 5 metrics to master customer experience and a recording of the webinar. And as I just mentioned, we'll continue with the question segment. So what I've done is I've opened up the chat to everybody. So what you can do is just type into the chat if you have any questions, and yeah, we'll answer them. As of right now, it looks like Dan has asked how much is Brightmetrics. Peter, do you want to maybe speak to that?
Sure. So Brightmetrics varies in cost a little bit depending on what you want to use it for. At a very high level, we have 3 different modules in Brightmetrics: a core, an ECC, and a real-time module. I'll start with the middle one. I said contact center is a module that only customers who use contact center need. In my understanding, most of the audience today doesn't use contact center, so I won't really talk about that one here. If you do use contact center and you want to ask about that, I'm happy to go through it, but I'll kind of avoid that one just from what Aaron and Austin told me about the audience today. The core module is what allows for historical data reporting across the environment. Basically, it's everything I showed you today. It is tiered based on the number of user extensions you have across your system. At the low end, if you're under 100 user extensions, it's $99 a month or $1089 per year, $1,089 per year. At the high end, if you're over 500 customers, it's double that, $21.89 per year or $199 a month. So that's kind of the spread. There's also a middle level, 100 to 500 users. That's $149 a month or $1639 per year. That's everything I showed you today. The other side of what we can do is we can actually monitor your environment in real time through our real-time module. That's typically used for work groups and ECC groups. It technically can monitor any user extension, but most often it's work group customers that are looking for a dashboard or a wallboard around what's happening right now, how many calls are waiting in my work group, what's my average wait time today, what is my team doing, who's logged in, who's not, those kinds of details. We can monitor all that live. That's part of our real-time module. There's different levels depending on how many unique perspectives you want to create. Most people start in the base tier, which is up to 5 dashboards, 1 to 5 dashboards. It's another $99 a month or $1089 per year, essentially. That's kind of the basic price points. So you're looking at anywhere from around just over $1,000 a year to upwards of say $3,000 a year for large environments that also want the real time. Again, contact center adds some more on top of that, but in my understanding, that's probably not a topic for most of the audience here today.
And like we mentioned earlier, we can set up a 21-day free pilot for you that will help you utilize this in your environment and see if the benefits that we've shown you today are applicable for you guys. Austin, any other questions come in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So another question from Tom is, where is Brightmetrics stored? Is it cloud or on-premise?
I can answer that. So we are a cloud-based application, but with regards to where the data is stored, that's actually a slightly different answer. So the way that we interact with the environment is there's, you heard about how the free trial can be set up. It's really a simple install, 10-15 minutes. What that install is doing is actually installing a software agent directly into the premise environment. Really, it can go on any server in the environment. Most commonly, it goes on the HQ server. In fact, ShoreTel and Mitel's own technical services teams install us directly on the HQ server of some of the largest customers they work with across the world. So generally, the HQ server. What that agent does is it communicates with Brightmetrics for 2 purposes. It communicates on an hourly basis, summarized information, so summarized information in aggregate. So things like, call volumes, trends. It does not summarize or send any information about detailed caller information, so things like caller IDs and so forth. That data is stored in our application. The summarized data is stored in our application. Our application is built in Microsoft Azure. What's important for you to understand in all that is anytime you're running a query for a cradle to grave or a detailed report that includes sensitive caller information, things like caller ID, customer name, that sort of detail, we're not actually storing any of that information. What we do is we send a request to that software agent that lives on the environment. That agent queries the CDR database directly to pull those records, encrypts them, and displays them in the browser. They're not stored on Brightmetrics servers. They're not stored locally on the machine. So that interaction essentially allows us to be very, very secure with your data. We have the ability for very fast dynamic reporting at the summary level with that aggregated information. But anytime you need something secure, that's all queried directly on the system. I'll tell you, today we work with around 3,500 ShoreTel/Mitel customers, and two of our largest spaces that we play in are healthcare and finance. I'm sure many of you can imagine the regulations that come around where data is stored with the healthcare and finance, HIPAA and PCI compliance. We've never had an issue. The way that we've architected our system is to directly address those concerns. Data that is sensitive, that could be customer identifiable, remains on your system, is not stored off of the system, and is not stored on Brightmetrics.
All right, I believe that the question segment. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and just let us know if a completely free, tailored 21-day pilot is something that you're interested in, yeah, we'll go from there. I'll be sending out the recorded version and the document for Peter's segment after the webinar concludes, which is essentially right now.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.